Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. Our program today is California Against the Sea, Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline. Today's interview guest has stated, "The coast is never saved. It is always being saved." Along California's 1,200-mile coastline, the overheated Pacific Ocean is rising and pressing in, imperiling both wildlife and the maritime towns and cities that 27 million people call home. And yes, Santa Cruz and the California Central Coast is experiencing this pressing in right now. What are the impacts of engineered landscapes, the market pressures of development, and the ecological activism and political scrimmages that have carved up our contemporary coastline? Do they foretell even greater changes to our shores? We have big things to do. Our bold interview guest today is Rosanna Xia. Rosanna Xia is an environmental reporter for the LA Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for explanatory reporting, and her work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. Her award-winning book, California Against the Sea, has been praised as a beautiful and revelatory exploration of how we relate to the natural world. Welcome to Be Bold America, Rosanna.
Hi, Jill. Thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, it is my pleasure. As you know, Rosanna, Mike Clancy was supposed to co-host your interview with me today, but he developed a sore throat and couldn't be here, but I bet he's listening.
Yeah, I hope Mike feels better soon. I know he's in with us in spirit today, and I had the joy of meeting him at another talk last year. So hello, Mike, and thank you for bringing us all together.
Yes, and you know what was nice, too? Before he became ill, he drafted several questions for the interview. So I have to thank him for that, too. Mike writes great questions since he is on the Leon Panetta Lecture Series question review team. So I'd like to begin with one. Mike said that your book, California Against the Sea, is beautifully written and expressive. It was a joy to read. Was the writing style and process you adopted in doing the book different from what you are used to as a reporter for the Los Angeles Times? If so, was it difficult to shift gears in writing the book?
Oh, gosh. I mean, thank you. I'm so touched to hear this from, both you and Mike. I think the biggest difference, and yes, I definitely had to shift gears, or maybe expand gears would be the better way to say it, but I really felt myself grow as a writer in this process, and just like thinking through how to piece everything together in a book-length story and a book-length journey for the reader. So I think on that end, I have two thoughts here. My editor, I'll share this, after my first draft, and I had an incredible editor on this book. Big shout out to Martina Satras at Heyday Books. So after, I agonized for years on the manuscript and finally submitted my first draft to Martina, she told me after reading it that, this is great. The reporting is incredible. So many interesting details and yada, yada, yada. But she said, but how this manuscript right now feels like a collection of 13 great LA Times articles, but it doesn't quite feel like a book. What can we do to help make these chapters be in better conversation with each other? How do we help each chapter build, again, towards this broader, longer, bigger kind of picture conversation, this narrative? And I was really floored by that and stumped by that for quite some time. And the other thing that Martina said to me that really grounded me and pushed me as a writer and a reporter was, she said, Rosanna, a book needs to attend to not just the intellectual journey of the reader. It also has to attend to the philosophical journey of the reader and ultimately their emotional journey. And I think as a, straight news, old school, like newspaper reporter, I had a moment where I was like, oh my God, I'm so focused so often on the intellectual journey, getting the facts right, figuring out how to translate the science in the most accessible way, how to connect policy and all these geeky things. But ultimately, the way I'm thinking about these issues are very grounded in the intellectual kind of aspects of these conversations. But you can't talk about sea level rise and our future and our relationship to the ocean without also thinking about the emotional aspects. And ultimately, I think the philosophical aspects of how we shift our own thinking and relationship to this really incredible landscape.
Wow. Well, leave it to an editor to say, but.
Oh my gosh, the but always gets you.
Gets you.
Yeah, I would just say that I think for every great book you read, great article that you read, there is always an editor who is not named behind the scenes, making everything so much more focused and so much more powerful. So big shout out to all the great editors out there.
Well, also another question from Mike is that you refer to the California Coastal Act of 1976 throughout the book. Can you give us a brief rundown on its history and importance?
Yes. And Mike, thank you for getting straight into it. So, the California Coastal Act of 1976, for those who aren't familiar, this law, it's pretty incredible. It's one of my favorite talking points whenever you're stuck with me at a cocktail party, but it's such a fun fact about California. The Coastal Act was passed by a voter initiative in the 1970s. And this law also created the California Coastal Commission, which was the first state government agency ever created by the vote of the people. And this law and the commission just really set the tone on how we build and not build along the California coast. And it essentially made the philosophical stand that the coast is this broader public good that cannot be owned by anyone. And so therefore the coast belongs to everyone. If you think about other beaches and coastlines, I often point to Florida and New Jersey, and I just came back from Massachusetts where I grew up. Just this idea of a private beach is just not the same in California. It doesn't exist. And I often, think about just how special it is to be in a state where access to the beach is considered a fundamental right for every single person. And, connecting it back to sea level rise, I often hear from folks, where do we even begin when it comes to juggling the social, political, and economic pressures along the coast and thinking about sea level rise? And in California, the Coastal Act truly is a great foundation. It's a starting point. It's a continuing point in terms of just providing a policy framework for how we navigate and balance these competing interests. And I think the thing I'll also note is, it was passed in 1976. We were definitely not thinking about sea level rise in 1976 in the way we're thinking about it now. And I have come to see the Coastal Act as a living document, and it has continued to require bold leadership to interpret it with, increasingly more modern issues and more complicated and challenging issues. So it has been really fascinating to follow kind of the way the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission has continued to evolve and adapt to these very pressing challenges today.
Now, did I hear you say that the act was done by proposition?
Yes, it was a ballot measure. It was voter initiative. And, similar to a lot of really kind of transformational policies in California, it started with, a very forward-thinking lawmaker trying to pass a bill and failing to get it out of both houses and getting it signed. And again, there's a lot of political pressure on this front. And so ultimately, after the second or third try, they turned to a ballot initiative, collected signatures, got it, before directly to the people. And the people of California voted, yes, we want to protect our coast and we want to make sure that our coast is a broader public good.
Do you remember who that legislator was?
Yes, Alan Cerroti. And it was a huge coalition of folks, too.
Right.
But Alan Cerroti was the author of the bill, championed by, Peter Douglas, who's also a legend in coastal conservation in California. And, I would say that this was truly a coming together of so many Californians to, push forward this vision for a coastline and to protect the coastline from, unchecked development and all the things that, I think I'll quote Peter Douglas, who said once that the legacy of the Coastal Act is actually the things that you do not see when you drive along the coast. And the fact that you're able to see the ocean and it's not blocked by super high rises and all these, and even more oil rigs and industrial infrastructure. So I think it is a really interesting legacy to think about as you're driving along, the coastal highway today.
Well, I think it's good to remind people about it because 1976 was quite a while ago now. And there's a couple of generations that have just accepted the way the coastline looks now and doesn't realize how it was protected. So it's good to bring this education back. And did it also create the Coastal Commission?
Yes, it did. Created the Coastal Commission and the policy framework in which we think and balance kind of all the competing interests along our shoreline today.
Do you have any comments about the Coastal Commission today? How it's working?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's like, it is definitely one of the, I mean, it's the last checkpoint, the last safeguard in so many of our environmental planning processes along the coast. And I will note, the commission was gutted quite a bit shortly after it was created in the 1970s. And
who gutted it? How did that happen?
Just, a number of a lot of pushback in subsequent legislative sessions. And, one of the biggest things was the Coastal Commission's ability to regulate housing and a lot of other things. And I would just say that the Coastal Commission has struggled over the years to enforce or uphold some of these core values that the public has tasked them with, given some of these limitations. And the other thing that I have come to really observe and notice is that the Commission is so underfunded given the enormity of their task. I mean, they manage and oversee more than 1,200 miles of shoreline. And I was stunned to learn when I first started covering the coast just how relatively small the agency is given just how much coast they have to cover. So I think they are, they're known as a very spirited government agency, very mission-driven, and very short-staffed, but very dedicated to just the mission that the public tasked them with since the 1970s.
Well, in 1976, would you say that the legislation, the people behind it, was it bipartisan?
I would say that protecting the coast was something that was widely supported by the people, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was passed by a pretty significant majority the year the ballot measure was brought to the voters.
It shouldn't be political because it's our coastline, and it's a very precious resource, and all of us enjoy it, regardless of our political affiliations. But I just wondered, over the years, whether the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the state of California had any impact on the Coastal Commission or the Act. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and Jill, that's actually a really, really good point. And I'll step even further back. Something that I find myself reminding folks a lot, especially when I'm speaking to, students in classes, but, environmental protection and, some of our most iconic federal bills, the Clean Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, all of the big environmental protection laws that came of age during the 1960s, after Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, everything that came of age from the modern environmental movement and the laws that were passed in the 1970s. And the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Act, was definitely created kind of in this wave of just interest in protecting the environment. Most of the laws at the federal level were signed by President Nixon. Protecting the environment wasn't a Republican versus Democrat issue back in the day. There was a collective kind of understanding that we shouldn't be polluting our rivers to the point that they catch fire. That was one of the sparking points of the modern environmental movement. Mm-hmm. I don't think oil spills off the coast, whenever there is one, you see a lot of bipartisan kind of collective coming together regarding all of this, because again, it isn't as controversial as it should be. And it has, with climate change, especially these days, it's become politicized, but it wasn't always this way.
Well, I think it's a great point to just make that it is bipartisan. It's everyone that cares about this. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station, serving the California Central Coast. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is California Against the Sea, Visions for a Vanishing Coastline. The author of the book by the same name is Rosanna Xia. Rosanna is an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for explanatory reporting, and her work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writings series. To read Rosanna's latest articles on climate, visit latimes.com. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Did you know that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the United States? Isn't it about time we own some too? KSQD 90.7 FM, your community radio station, your voice, your concerns. Go to www.ksqd.org to get involved and support locally owned grassroots community media. K-Squid, KSQD FM.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talk and Conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
We're back. Would you like a friend to hear this interview on California Against the Sea? Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Subscribe for free from your favorite podcast platform or listen to the show at Be Bold America's homepage on the ksqd.org website. Also, KSQD is proud to announce that we now have a mobile app so that you may listen to your favorite shows anytime from your smartphone. You can download it from the App Store or go to ksqd.org/KSQD app. That's KSQD app. Now you may listen to KSQD's great programming from anywhere around the world. And another neat feature, when you have installed the KSQD mobile app on your phone, you're able to text shows directly with questions and comments. Now, Rosanna, the strategy of managed retreat for dealing with sea level rise and the strong emotions and political peril it engenders is a frequent theme in the book. Can you define what is meant by managed retreat and talk about why it has become such a flashpoint in California?
Yeah, and probably not just in California. I think managed retreat is something that has been a very controversial term in many communities when introduced kind of at the planning level in local communities and, in any coastal community in this country. And it sounds super intense, but managed retreat essentially is just acknowledging that the ocean is moving inland and that, we need to move the homes and roads and other critical infrastructure out of the way before we're in the way from the ocean. And it's, I've been thinking a lot about this as a writer too. Like the words managed retreat just elicit such a emotional response, as you noted. And some of it might be just because no one likes to be managed, and retreat in a lot of ways just feels like we're giving up. So I think for me, I've been thinking about how we shift away from the language that we've been using kind of, and it's very jargony. It's kind of like the default term in these spaces when you're talking to planners and engineers about adaptation to sea level rise. But, ultimately this idea of, managed retreat versus holding the line in perpetuity is such a black and white binary that we've kind of locked ourselves into when we first started debating the what do we do about sea level rise question. And I do think there's a lot of gray in between the hold the line and retreat. And that's kind of where the book starts to explore what it means to start transitioning and just explore these kind of middle areas. And ultimately, these two extremes have polarized the conversation in such an intense way that ultimately the communities that can't move past this binary get stuck. And the ocean ultimately is moving in whether we like it or not. And someone once told me it's either managed retreat or unmanaged retreat. And right now we still have time to plan ahead before the disaster strikes.
Well, your point about language is very important because most people don't know that the phrase climate change was something that the fossil fuel industry came up with to lower the panic or urgency regarding our climate, because they could make the case that climate's always changing, right? Of course, they want to confuse weather with climate, but, it's always changing. It doesn't sound as urgent. And so people have adopted that phrase when, in fact, Vice President Al Gore uses the words climate crisis or climate emergency. So does Greta Thunberg. I mean, the language of climate change, I think, keeps us from reacting as urgently as we should. If we start thinking about it's the climate crisis or climate chaos or climate emergency, people might be able to think of it as something that higher up on the agenda of action. So I think you're right about the phrase manage retreat. Now, you also talked about gray. You mentioned the green to gray scale in your book as a way to characterize most responses to sea level rise. Can you define this and tell us why it is so important?
Yes, and I'm just geeking out so hard right now on this discussion on climate change. So hold the thought on green to gray for a moment. I just want to build for a second on the climate change note. You're reminding me that something that I am often, reflecting on, and I do this a lot with journalism students when I'm talking about environmental writing. Climate change, in addition to everything that you just said, it's also become such a vague term. And I think for me, the more precise we can get, the more we can meet people where they're at. So rather than talking about climate change, how about let's talk about wildfires, coastal flooding, drought. And if you think about when I'm in a classroom, for example, I'll ask students raise your hand and, define climate change for me. Or what do you think of when I say the words climate change? And inevitably the students start to talk about stories. Oh, this, and I think the more we can become more precise with the way we talk about climate change rather than just using it as a crutch to describe all of these things and, allow for the reader to assume what we're talking about. I think the more precise we get, the more we'll be able to advance the conversation.
I love that. That's right. I love that, being more specific. And then gray to green scale. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think, so when we think about all of our choices in terms of what we can do to respond to sea level rise, oh my God, the ocean's moving in, it's getting closer and closer to the things that we want to protect. What do we do? And when you talk to, the coastal engineers, the conservationists, and the sea level rise specialists, they've started to categorize some of these solutions on this quote unquote gray to green scale. And so gray is one end of the extreme. It's just holding the line with concrete, with, a pile of rocks. You've probably seen it along the coastal highway and places kind of along the shoreline wherever you go. That is
often
that basically has very little room to budge anymore. And it's just, the rock revetments, the hard concrete. And that is a very gray solution. That is a very just, you're trying to hold the line for as long as possible, and everything in front of that line eventually gets drowned out, including the beaches and the wetlands. And so there are a lot of challenges and costs and sacrifices that come with such a hard, unmoving solution. And then green, on the other end of the extreme, is completely just, the buzzy word right now is nature-based solutions, allowing for the ocean to migrate inland as the ocean's migrating inland, allowing for the natural processes of the shoreline, cliffs to erode and help rebuild beaches, but really just creating the space for nature to do its thing along the shoreline. And, given how built out our environment is along so much of the California coast, a purely green solution is also not quite realistic in many places. And so between this gray to green scale, I think this is where a lot of opportunity for creativity comes in. This is where I think a lot of communities are now thinking towards, and I think this is where we have so much opportunity to be imaginative. And so what does it mean to be somewhere between green and gray? And there are a lot of really interesting examples that are emerging. I'm thinking of Cardiff, kind of in the northern San Diego area. The coastal highway there through Encinitas was flooding pretty consistently during the winter high swells. And because all of the agencies there were not quite ready to physically relocate the highway further inland to quote unquote manage that retreat, rather than, do the obvious emergency gut instinct response, which is to just build a seawall or put a pile of boulders in front of the road to protect it from the rising ocean. What is a in-between solution. And so the Coastal Conservancy and a lot of other agencies came together to get creative. And so they did build a low, rock revetment along the coastal highway. And then they brought a bunch of sand and put it on top of the rocks and created a dune system that, is backed by a low seawall. But the sand on top, they were able to vegetate it. They were able to kind of rehabilitate and bring back this ecosystem that used to exist on the beach that, folks have forgotten about. And now there's this really beautiful trail along the highway. And so during the winter, sometimes the sand acts as more natural buffer against the rising ocean. And then this is also ultimately, as one person put it to me, buying time for all of the agencies to continue the conversation of, okay, what is the longer term plan of this highway? We now have a little bit more time that is not, just reverting back to the super gray solution of just holding the line and just hoping that we will always overcome the ocean, which, that is just not going to be feasible in the long term.
Impossible. It's so powerful. Well, also, I think this might be a good time to take a break because the next questions I want to ask, which Mike had written for me here, I want to put together. And so let's take a break right now. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station, serving the California Central Coast. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. We are interviewing Rosanna Xia. Rosanna is an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. To read Rosanna's latest articles on climate, visit latimes.com. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled, "Want to Cool Earth? Just Block the Sun. Simple." I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Challenging conventional wisdom can advance society's understanding of truth. Good. Arrogantly challenging the complex balance of nature, however, can go kablooey. Very bad. In recent times, there's been an unfortunate tendency for some scientific hotshots to send society off on techno-tangents to, quote, remake nature, promising miracles. About 70 years ago, for example, a so-called ag science genius promised that dumping synthetic pesticides on monoculture crops across the globe would end hunger. Chemical giants and governments rushed to do the dump, but the fix ultimately resulted in the ongoing poisoning of Earth's land, water, food, and people, while enriching agricultural monopolists and allowing hunger to rage. Unfortunately, insistence by technologists and profiteers that they can outsmart and overwhelm nature is now being pushed with cosmic vengeance. A covey of arrogant academics and billionaire backers are saying, trust us, we can handle that little global warming issue. One is named David Keith, running a $100 million, quote, stratospheric solar geoengineering scheme named Scopex. Keith proposes to solve global warming by, get this, dispensing volumes of sulfur dioxide into the Earth's stratosphere to, quote, regulate the amount and location of sunlight around the globe. Gosh, what could go wrong with that? Never mind the unknown consequences of tampering with basic nature, argues Keith, for his bold techno-fix to global warming bypasses the political difficulty of ending our fossil fuel addiction. So we should just do it. This is Jim Hightower saying Keith does admit that he can be inappropriately forceful. I'm intense, he says. Well then, let's all chip in for some therapy sessions to help him overcome his megalomania before he makes an irreversible mess of the only planet we have that sustains life. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
Welcome back. And our bold guest today is Rosanna Xia, and we're discussing Rosanna's award-winning book, California Against the Sea, that has been praised as a beautiful and revelatory exploration of how we relate to the natural world. Now, Rosanna, before we move on, do you have any thoughts to share after hearing Jim Hightower's commentary?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. That was really fun. Jim has such a compelling way of framing and explaining things, and I'm finding myself really inspired. Yeah, and I think what he's saying here gets to the heart of some of the big questions that we're wrestling right now with climate change, right? Like, can we engineer our way out of the problems we had created from past imbalances with nature? Can we control nature, overcome the forces of nature, beat climate change, so to speak? If we had just come up with some brilliant technology that rises above all of this. And, on the one hand, we do owe it to ourselves to think creatively with a problem as massive and existential as climate change. But I would say that, as past examples have shown us, nature is this incredibly layered and interconnecting system with brilliant checks and balances baked in. And, for us humans to disrupt these balances does tend to, have, it has prompted, pretty unexpected and often devastating consequences, as Jim has also pointed out. And I'm thinking of Elizabeth Colbert, who's a writer at The New Yorker and just the biggest environmental writing hero for me. She wrote a book a few years ago called Under a White Sky that looks at many of these geoengineering ideas that are starting to dominate the climate change conversation. And it's a really fascinating book, and I'd encourage everyone to read it. I was thinking of Elizabeth Colbert as I was listening to Jim talk about all of this.
Well, thank you for that. Mike had pointed out in his questions the city of Pacifica. You had described the city of Pacifica as an example of what happens when you have unmanaged retreat. You talked about managed retreat, but unmanaged retreat. Can you give us a brief history of what has happened in Pacifica with regard to the impact of sea level rise?
Yeah, Pacifica does get it pretty hard sometimes being in the news every time there's a big storm, especially with just how dramatic the waves hit the bluffs in their main boardwalk every time the tide gets particularly high. And, for those listening, not, unfamiliar with Pacifica, it's a really beautiful town just south of San Francisco along the outer coast. And I was actually just at a sea level rise conference recently where one of Pacifica's city council members was joking that the town has become known for the town famous for dog surfing. There's a really famous dog surfing.
Oh, that's right. I know. We read it in the newspaper. It's very cute.
And she said Pacifica is also known for the most beautiful Taco Bell in the world because there's a Taco Bell right on the beach.
On the beach, yes. That's right.
And she said, and this is the punchline to her joke, and Pacifica is known for the town, famous for homes falling into the ocean. And, but in all seriousness, I think Pacifica is just such a prescient and, evocative place to start the story of sea level rise in California. And it's a great place to go deeper into why change might feel so insurmountable for a community. And, this town has such a fascinating history and one of the most, comprehensive, incredible historical societies I've ever visited along the California coast. So definitely check out the Historical Society, too, if you're ever in town. And as I was learning about all the history and all the work it took the community of Pacifica to truly become a community, to become incorporated as a town, and to just, stake a claim in its right to exist, it made me start to wonder, too, what actually makes a place home, and what does it mean to protect a place that so many people love and have fought so hard for, in the face of such an existential crisis like sea level rise. So managed retreat, again, that term has been hugely controversial in this town. It's very taboo. You'll read most planning documents today in Pacifica, and those words you will not find in the documents. And it's ironic, too, because what was interesting and what is still interesting about Pacifica is that, their mayor and city council, years ago, Pacifica was one of the first cities to actually start early and proactively try to get ahead of this issue and to try to start the planning process and to start thinking through all of the steps they need to take to anticipate this disaster that has become so present to their community. And it has just become this incredibly fraught back and forth for years now on how to proceed into the future. And there's been a lot of changes in local political leadership and just, ultimately, I think what is interesting to me about Pacifica, too, is that I really wanted to bring nuance into this issue and also to gently help point out to readers and to other communities, too, all the ways the coast has already been changing in Pacifica and in so many other places. And, how in the absence of quote-unquote managed retreat, there has already been quite a bit of retreat over the years. It's a little bit more unmanaged, whether from individual property owners on top of a bluff having to move away after one too many storms. That is retreat, whether we want to call it managed retreat or not. Or the city years ago chose to move some public infrastructure farther away from the shoreline as the ocean, started moving in. So there are certainly some very important lessons to learn from Pacifica, and Pacifica ultimately offers a really helpful glimpse into the future that, so many other communities will be facing, either just now or in the near future. And I think there's also a lot to learn from a community that really made the effort to try to get ahead of it and just start early in this conversation.
You also talk about Gleason Beach, just north of Bodega Bay, as a possible future for many of California's beaches if the state fails to properly prepare for rising sea levels. And as Mike writes in his question, and it's not pretty picture, can you talk about how Gleason Beach came to be the way it is and why it's a warning for the rest of California's coastal communities?
Yeah, I would say Gleason Beach is another, maybe a warning, but more also like a glimpse into kind of what compromise will, the spirit, it's a glimpse into the spirit of compromise and the spirit of kind of really acknowledging that the coast as we know it today might have to transform in some, unimaginable way or less imaginable way going into the future in order to accommodate the rising ocean. And so Gleason Beach, for those who are not familiar, is along the Sonoma coast, just north of Bodega Bay. And there used to be, one geologist once told me he thinks of Gleason Beach as Malibu North because topographically it's very similar with cliffs and a coastal highway that is the main thoroughfare for the community over there. And there's this one stretch of Gleason Beach where there used to be 10 homes on top of this beautiful bluff, and there used to be a much, much wider beach buffering the cliffs. And nowadays, like the ocean is just pounding right up against the cliff face, and a number of homes have caved to the ocean. The homeowners have had to manage their own retreat. And you can see some of the remnants of like the foundations of the homes and the piping and everything kind of piled up along the edges of the bluffs. And just, the story there is just over the decades, every property owner there had to ultimately make their own decisions on when it was time to move. And on top of that, now that so many of the homes are gone, that was the first line of defense against the ocean once the sand and the wider beaches have gone away. And, now the coastal highway in certain stretches is also kind of very close to falling into the ocean. There was a period of time a few years ago where the highway had to be reduced by one lane because of just how close the cliff was crumbling. Yeah, it was. Wow. You should look up the photos. It was pretty stunning. And, Caltrans was saying for a while that, it just wasn't worth continuing to respond to the emergency of the road almost falling into the ocean. And so, I want to say it was like 15 years ago, almost 2 decades ago, again, a bunch of agencies came together at the state, federal, and local level, at the county level, and they really came together to think about how do we completely rethink how we're responding to this very present threat. And, ultimately the coastal highway there is so critical to the community. It's their only way in and out during an emergency like a wildfire. It's, if you have a loved one who needs to go to the hospital, like that, you need that road to get to the nearest hospital. It's how kids go to school. And so preserving that highway felt critical in a number of ways. And so how do you protect the road while also acknowledging that the shoreline is eroding? And so the final kind of compromise decision, and it definitely had some controversy, and it took the community some time to kind of come around to it, is to build this massive bridge and to elevate the entire, like, a mile of the highway and just completely reroute it, like, a little bit further inland. And, like, so it's up and over. And, the folks who are not as pleased about the solution have called the bridge they say it looks like an overpass, and it is pretty big. But, the compromise there, too, is like by elevating the road, they were able to completely start restoring the creek that had been choked off by the highway. The wetland is now allowed to kind of start building back. And it's really interesting to see what, by allowing space for the ocean to interact with the estuary, like the wetlands, I'm really curious to see how it's going to transform in the future. And ultimately, I think there was a lot of heartache in transforming such a beautiful part of the coast. And I think the story is still being, the ending of the story is still being found. And it's a really interesting example of just what it means to have to come together to rethink the coastline as we've come to know it.
Well, and as you know, my second book was called Climate Abandoned. And I had an author, a chapter author there in the book named Mike Newland, who's the director of the Northern California Cultural Resources Group for Environmental Science Associates. We look at the coastline as of today and what's happening, but there's also archaeological issues going on. Mike is an archaeologist, and I wanted to read something he wrote in his chapter, Archaeology versus the Climate Crisis, and get your thoughts on the other side. He wrote, "Archaeological sites are more than just great repositories of artifacts that reveal much about human behavior. In fact, they contain data about what the environment used to be like, including past climate change events. Coastal sites are the most immediately vulnerable to climate change. There, the high shell content reduces soil acidity, increasing natural preservation of thousands of years of untapped environmental and climate data. Archaeological sites are our only access to this important data, and those sites are quickly disappearing as a result of climate change." What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you for sharing those passages from your book. I mean, the questions Mike is exploring in that chapter is something I've heard from a number of indigenous communities up and down the coast, and also from researchers and scientists. And I mean, I think the thing I'll add here is just, thinking about what you just shared from the book is that, in the course of writing California Against the Sea, I really started to reflect on who we tend to value as expert, right? And, what we tend to value as data. Yes, peer-reviewed science is super important. Assessments by licensed coastal engineers, very important. Historians, anthropologists, we have so many forms of validated expertise, and they're all critical to the discussion. But, where does something like indigenous knowledge fit in? How about the lived experiences of frontline communities and just their generations of anecdotal evidence of what it has been like to live on the front lines of climate change? And so, with the reporting process of my book, I also try to gently recalibrate how we honor and utilize these various forms of knowledge. And, the book begins, for example, with an age-old story from the Chumash. And rather than just present it as a beautiful story or a legend, and it is, this Chumash story is also being introduced as a very important data point in sea level rise. And it's actually perhaps the first ever oral record of sea level rise along what we know today as the California coast. And so, hearing kind of what you're sharing too, is just, I think there is, and Mike says this too, I think in your chapter, that there is something really powerful about archaeological evidence in terms of providing the data points that we often seek in Western science and Western research as a valid form of knowledge. But I think that, I would encourage everyone listening today to think about kind of how we can expand who we listen to and who we value as expert in this conversation about how we live in better relationship with nature.
Well, I have another question from Mike Newland's work, but we'll do that after the break. If you're just joining us, my bold guest today is Rosanna Xia. Rosanna is an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for explanatory reporting, and her work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. Her award-winning book, California Against the Sea, has been praised as a beautiful and revelatory exploration of how we relate to the natural world. You may reach Rosanna's work or read her work at thelaTimes.com. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Serving the California coast, many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
And stay tuned in to KSQD this evening at 6 for Cats on Dogs, Insights for Both Ends of the Leash with your host, Lori Katz. Lori is a certified professional dog trainer, and each month she welcomes another dog expert to offer advice you and your canine companions can use. That's Cats on Dogs, this evening from 6 p.m. until 7 here on KSQD 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM and KSQD.org. Many voices, one station.
As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you may listen to the show anytime for free by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. So now that I had one more question before we get going on the Keep Stop Starts, and that is that Mike also talked about the challenges that our indigenous peoples have today about the coastline, because for them climate change is a profoundly complex topic for many tribal people. At the heart of most of their discussions is the question, is climate change the will of the Creator or an act of mankind? If it's the Creator's will, Mike Newland writes, then the response from the tribal community is to let it unfold, whatever the outcome. If it is an act of mankind, on the other hand, the only acceptable and responsible response is to protect tribal natural resources and their cultural heritage to the best of their ability. How tribal governments and elder councils answer this spiritual question has a direct effect on how tribes choose to respond with concrete action, policy, and advocacy. And one of your quotes from your book, Rosanna, was, "Adaptation ultimately is about choice. It's about choosing what to preserve, choosing what to let change, and choosing what to intentionally change in a new and reimagined way." Care to expand on the Creator versus mankind and choice?
That's a fascinating pairing of quotes, and you are getting my mind going in so many directions.
Great.
I think the thing I'll say here is that, first off, there are so many indigenous communities up and down the California coast.
1,200 miles.
The Oregon border all the way to the Mexico border, and also, not counting the hundreds of miles of inner San Francisco Bay shoreline. And just in the process of getting to know so many communities, I feel like I would love to pose that question to every indigenous community, because I think there will be nuances that I feel like I can't speak to. But I think the thing, just hearing you read Mike's quote, that is making me I want to really index on this. Just, so often in these spaces, I feel like we still talk about indigenous people in the past tense.
Right.
And, then, sometimes it gets over romanticized too. Like, oh, it was all, rainbows and butterflies back in the day when we lived in harmony with nature and yada, yada, yada. And it was, but it still can be. And I think the thing for me as like someone who writes about these issues in present day, and as I'm, for example, writing a book that is trying to help people deepen the way they think about how we move into the future, I do want to really make clear that indigenous communities in California and everywhere, they're not just in the past tense. They are our friends and neighbors and colleagues today. And we should be speaking about them in present tense. And ultimately, they are so critical to how we think about resetting and making these choices and how we want to live in better relationship with nature going into the future. And step one is making sure that these indigenous communities are at the table and in these conversations, because so often they are still pretty noticeably absent, or if they are included, it's kind of this, the indigenous perspectives are not quite fully in conversation with the Western science and the policies and government structures that we kind of quote unquote manage our natural resources today. So I would encourage everyone kind of working in this space to first and foremost start by posing these questions to indigenous communities, bringing indigenous communities into the conversation in a meaningful in a substantial way, and ultimately like recognizing that they are not only in past and from the past, they're also very much in the present and critical to our future.
That was a wonderful answer, and I wonder how we can do that, but I guess that's a whole nother show.
Yes, how much time we've got.
Yeah, really. And, well, actually, we're moving into Keep, Stop, Start. You know, Rosanna, in these last few minutes, I'd like to ask what ideas you might have for us to keep doing, stop doing, start doing, as they relate to California Against the Sea and as they relate to how we start valuing, looking at our coastline in California.
Yes. Jill, I love that you include this in all your episodes.
Thank you.
What a great framework. So for the keep doing, I'd say keep learning. You know, keep reading about sea level rise. Keep talking about it with your friends and neighbors. Call your local city environmental planner and ask for the latest information on sea level rise, adaptation. Support and help empower your local city officials to not be afraid to talk about this issue and to kind of invite more people into this conversation. This is a huge, long-term, ongoing conversation that, you know, has no easy answers, but it's such an important conversation to have, and you don't have to do it alone. You know, I'm so grateful to you, Jill, and everyone listening today, just, you know, being willing to spend your time thinking about this issue. And one thing I've really felt since this book came out is that so many people have been ready and have wanted to have these conversations. So everyone, let's keep talking about it.
Just a comment on that before you're getting to stop is that, you know, I think we're suffering from a lack of leadership because a lot of people do want to have this conversation. I know I do. I know my listeners do. And it's not even in our presidential election discussions. It's cursory, really. It's not. We don't have the leadership right now to coordinate this topic. So I just wanted to make that observation that we need, I guess, to lead our electeds. We need to be calling them more and asking them these questions in town halls and pushing them. As the ocean's pressing in on California, we need to press in on them because I think there are a lot of people that want to talk about this and find solutions, and the coordinating leadership isn't there from our elected officials. So that's my rant. Go ahead.
That's a great point. And I know we're right on time, but I'll just add quickly on that. I think also, you know, responding to climate change and sea level rise, like sea level rise has been characterized to me in so many spaces as a quote-unquote slow-moving disaster. It's not an easy political win. You know, there are so many other issues that you can achieve as a politician, a local politician, way faster that gets you a lot more brownie points than saving a town from sea level rise 80 years from now, right? We think in 2-year, 4-year, 8-year political terms. And I think part of that, too, is, again, like empowering your local officials to feel a sense of purpose and duty to act on this. And I do feel like there are a lot of, in the same way that a lot of people want to have this conversation, I know a lot of local leadership and, you know, state leadership too, that want to have this conversation. They want to just get started, but it is such a fiery, tense political topic that a lot of folks are afraid to start this conversation. So in whatever way you can in each of your communities, try to get that conversation going in a way that is not as fraught, and try to get people to come together as a community to think about the solutions and opportunities that this conversation can provide.
Right. So what should we stop and start doing in our last minute here?
Yes. Stop assuming the worst of someone you disagree with. You know, something that really surprised me and really grounded me in the course of just getting to know so many people for this book is just how much commonality we have. You know, someone would often tell me, like, don't talk to this guy, he's such a denier. And then I'll go for a walk with this person and he loves the ocean too. And he's picking up trash as we're walking along the beach. And I think that, you know, ultimately all the people who are in this conversation care. And I think in whatever way we can, to start conversations not by reinforcing the silos we're already in, I think we can move forward in a much more empathetic and productive way. And lastly, just to start doing, you know, I have so many thoughts here, you know, start volunteering, start or join a community garden or a local planning group that can help your neighborhood start the transitions you need to become more resilient. But I'll be honest, Jill, the first thing that came to mind when you told me to think about what I should encourage people to start doing is just go to the beach more often. Go for a walk.
Good idea.
Sit on a bench. pull over to an overlook and take your kids out on the sand. I mean, public access to the beach, to one of your first questions that Mike posed, is such a beautiful and powerful part of the California ethos. And every time I'm out by the water, I am so deeply humbled by what it means to be at the very edges of a continent. And, relatedly, go out and check out a wetland. The bigger ones, especially like Elkhorn Slough and the Monterey area, is a great one. There's just so much magic in these in-between spaces where land and ocean interact in such a profound way if we just give them the space to. And just, go kayaking through the Elkhorn Slough or go on a walking tour. It will just give you such a deeper appreciation for just how far the ocean can extend into land.
Well, go visiting our beaches.
What we want to call land.
Yes, and visiting our beaches and appreciating our coastline is also going to help the stress of our times to help us cope with those. So, Rosanna, thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. So good to have you on the show. I know I speak for Mike Clancy as well in saying you've written a brilliant book. Thank you for being on Be Bold America.
Thank you, Jill. You've got my mind going in so many directions. So
I love that.
Story ideas.
I love that. And you've got mine going in many directions, too. I'm going to visit the beach soon as well. What's up next on Be Bold America? On October 6th will be Burn Scars. We'll be welcoming back Dr. Char Miller, who is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at Pomona College, to discuss his new book, Burn Scars. Dr. Miller's book is the first documentary history of wildfire management in the United States that probes the long efforts to suppress fire, beginning with the 18th century Spanish invasion of California and continuing through the U.S. Fire Service's relentless nationwide campaign in the 20th century. The Forest Service argues that suppression is critical for good fire management. However, in recent years, in the American West, suppression has come under increasing scrutiny as a contributing factor to our current era of mega fires. So please join us again on October 6th at 5 p.m. for Burn Scars. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast, and also check out our new mobile app and download it. You can listen anywhere in the world. I want to give a special thank you to our talented program, Be Bold America's program engineer, Eliza James, and to our station's tireless program director, Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, KSQD Prunedale, Many Voices, One Station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org, or again, listen on our new mobile app. Stay tuned for Cats on Dogs, and remember, let your smile change the world. Don't let the world change your smile. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.